The Japanese corporal heard something impossible that night. Absolute silence from the Australian lines, followed exactly 4 hours and 32 minutes later by the sudden crackle of cooking fires blooming across the valley floor like orange flowers in the darkness. He pressed his ear harder against the bamboo listening tube, certain he'd missed something in between, but the recording wire told the same story. Nothing, then everything, precisely timed. If this format speaks to you, subscribe and support the video. Corporal Takeshi Yamada had been listening to the Australians for 3 weeks now, long enough to know their rhythms the way a fisherman knows tides. He understood when they relieved sentries, when they conducted equipment checks, when they cursed the mud and mosquitoes in their strange, rolling English. The listening post sat 200 meters up the ridge, concealed beneath palm fronds and camouflage netting, connected to 4 separate sound-gathering positions scattered across the forward slope. His equipment was primitive, but effective. Bamboo tubes angled toward enemy positions, a captured British field telephone modified to amplify ground vibrations, and his own ears. Trained since childhood to distinguish individual insects in a summer field back in Shikoku. The officers called it signals intelligence. Yamada called it listening to men try to stay alive in the dark. Tonight felt different. Yamada checked his pocket watch against the duty log, the brass case warm from resting against his chest. 0230 hours. The Australians should be brewing tea now, boiling water for their morning rations. They always did. He documented it 17 times in the past 21 days. The pattern was reliable enough that Lieutenant Sakamoto had begun timing mortar strikes around it, catching the enemy clustered around their cook fires like moths around lanterns. 2 days ago, a barrage at 0240 had killed 3 Australians and wounded 5 more. Yamada had heard their screams through the bamboo tubes, had written the casualty estimate in his report based on the number of voices calling for medics. But tonight the valley below remained dark and quiet. Just the usual sounds of the jungle settling into its pre-dawn rhythms, fruit bats returning to roost, insects adjusting their chorus, the distant cough of a tree kangaroo. Yamada adjusted the headset connected to the field telephone, listening to the earth itself. Vibrations traveled through soil and rock, footsteps, digging, the metallic scrape of mess tins against stone. Nothing. He made a notation in his log, precise characters forming columns in the dim red light of his shielded lamp. The silence felt deliberate somehow, like the pause before a kabuki actor delivers a killing line. Then he waited, because waiting was most of what war demanded once you stopped moving forward and started trying to hold ground that wanted to swallow you whole. Private Nakamura dozed at the second listening position, head nodding forward until Yamada threw a pebble that cracked against the man's helmet. Nakamura jerked upright, guilty and alert, his rifle coming halfway to his shoulder before he recognized the sound as correction rather than threat. Good. The Australians had snipers who watched for exactly that kind of carelessness, patient men who would wait hours for a single clear shot. 3 men had died in the past month from single rifle shots that arrived without warning, the sound of the bullet's impact reaching their ears before the distant crack of the rifle itself. The enemy understood patience, too. They'd learned it fighting in North Africa and Greece, places where staying alive meant thinking harder than the man trying to kill you. At 0428, the first fire appeared in the Australian sector, then another, 50 meters to the east. Within 6 minutes, 11 separate cooking fires burned across their defensive line, men moving in the glow like shadow puppets against a screen. Yamada marked the time, underlining it twice with his pencil. Too precise, too coordinated. Soldiers didn't wake up and decide to cook breakfast in perfect unison, unless someone told them to, unless orders had been given and followed with the kind of discipline that suggested those orders mattered for reasons beyond hunger. He'd seen enough of military life to know that chaos, not synchronization, governed the small decisions of tired men living in mud and fear. He recorded the observation in careful detail, noting wind direction, ambient temperature, the specific locations of each fire plotted against his hand-drawn map of the Australian positions. Then he wrote a single question in the margin, the characters bold and dark. _, quote, _, 0, _. The answer mattered because patterns meant intelligence, and intelligence meant someone on the Australian side was thinking several moves ahead, playing a game Yamada couldn't yet see the boundaries of. That made them dangerous in ways that simple firepower never could. When Sergeant Hayashi arrived to relieve him at 0800 hours, climbing the narrow trail with the careful steps of a man who knew mines and tripwires, Yamada showed him the log entries. Hayashi grunted, scanning the columns of times and coordinates with eyes that looked perpetually half-closed from exhaustion and sun damage. "You think too much, Corporal. They got hungry at a different time. It happens." But his eyes lingered on those underlined numbers, and Yamada saw the flicker of doubt there, the recognition of something wrong. Hayashi had survived 2 years in China before transferring to the Pacific, had seen entire companies walk into ambushes because someone ignored a pattern that seemed too small to matter. Men who survive that long learn to trust their instincts about wrongness, about patterns that shouldn't exist in the random chaos of war. Private Colin Walsh pulled the cold tin of stew from his pack and stared at it with the kind of resentment usually reserved for officers and leeches. The tin was slick with condensation, beaded with moisture from the jungle humidity that never stopped, not even at night when the temperature dropped just enough to make a man shiver in his sweat-soaked uniform. He'd been fantasizing about hot food for the past 6 hours, ever since the patrol had moved into position along this miserable stretch of ridge overlooking the Kokoda approach. Now Sergeant Morrow was telling them no fires, no heat, nothing that might give away their position to the Japanese listening posts everyone pretended to know about, but nobody had actually seen. Walsh used his bayonet to pry open the tin, the metal lid peeling back with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. Beside him, Private Davies did the same, working the blade around the rim with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd opened too many of these tins to count. The stew inside looked gray even in the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, chunks of mystery meat suspended in congealed fat that had gone solid in the cool night air. Walsh dug his spoon in and forced himself to eat, the cold grease coating his mouth and throat. "Quote 2, he whispered to Davies, keeping his voice low enough that Morrow might not hear. "Quote 3. Davies shook his head slightly, a gesture that meant shut up more than it meant disagreement. The man had been in since the beginning, had fought through the initial Japanese push and the long, brutal retreat that followed. He knew things Walsh didn't. Understood lessons written in blood that the replacements hadn't learned yet. Walsh took another spoonful of cold stew and swallowed his complaints along with the gelatinous meat. Sergeant Morrow moved through the section's position like a ghost, checking each man with a touch on the shoulder and a whispered word. When he reached Walsh, he crouched down and shoved another tin into the private's hands without preamble. Quote 4. His voice carried the flat authority of a man who'd stopped explaining orders weeks ago. "Why 0430, Sarge?" Walsh asked, genuinely curious despite his better judgment. "What's special about that time?" Morrow's face was invisible in the darkness, just a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky beyond the trees. For a moment, Walsh thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then the sergeant leaned closer, close enough that Walsh could smell the tobacco on his breath and the jungle rot that every man carried after enough time in the wet. "Microphones," Morrow said, the single word delivered like a diagnosis. Then he moved on to the next position, leaving Walsh to figure out what that meant. Davies let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. "The Japs have been listening," he whispered. "Blokes up at battalion reckon they've got listening gear all through the hills. Bamboo tubes, captured field phones, men trained to hear a whisper at 200 yards. They've been using it to target mortars, set up ambushes. You light a fire at the wrong time, they know exactly where you are." Walsh felt his skin prickle despite the warmth of the night. He thought about all the times he'd complained about cold rations, about the seemingly arbitrary rules that governed when they could smoke, when they could talk above a whisper, when they could do anything that might make them feel human, instead of like mud-covered animals creeping through the jungle. Suddenly, those rules made a different kind of sense, the kind that kept you alive instead of comfortable. Quote 10, he asked. Quote 11. Davies scraped the last of his stew from the tin and licked his spoon clean. Quote 12. The word hung in the air between them, full of doubt and possibility. Walsh looked down at his tin of cold stew, at the congealed fat and the chunks of meat that didn't bear thinking about too carefully. He thought about the Japanese soldiers sitting up there in the hills, with their ears pressed to bamboo tubes, listening for the sounds of men trying to eat, trying to live, trying to survive another night in this green hell. The idea made him want to stop breathing, to become perfectly still and silent until the enemy forgot he existed. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a branch snapped. Every man in the section froze, weapons coming up in silent unison. Walsh's hand found his rifle, thumb moving to the safety catch without conscious thought. They waited, counting heartbeats, listening for the follow-up sounds that would tell them whether it was an animal or a Japanese patrol probing their lines. Minutes crawled past. Nothing moved. Eventually, Morrow's whispered command came down the line. Stand down. Stay alert. Walsh relaxed his grip on the rifle, but didn't let go. Couldn't let go. Not anymore. He checked his watch. 3 hours and 42 minutes until they could light fires. 3 hours and 42 minutes of sitting in the dark with a belly full of cold stew, listening for enemies who might be listening right back. Captain Richard Thornley spread the patrol reports across his makeshift desk, weighted down with empty ammunition tins to keep the humid breeze from scattering them. The reports covered 3 weeks of operations, each one typed on thin paper that had already begun to deteriorate from the moisture that penetrated everything in this climate. He'd read them twice already, but kept returning to specific details, timestamps that appeared with troubling frequency, locations where contact with the enemy had been heaviest. The pattern existed. He just needed to prove it meant what he suspected it meant. A native scout named Kila entered the tent without announcing himself, moving with the silence that made the Papuan guides invaluable and occasionally unsettling. He carried a bamboo section in his hands, roughly 2 feet long and hollowed out with careful precision. Quote 13. Kila said in the mission school English that still carried the rhythms of his own language underneath. Quote 14. Thornley took the bamboo tube and examined it. The interior had been smoothed, the nodes removed to create an unobstructed channel. One end had been carved to fit against a human ear. Simple technology, the kind that required no batteries or replacement parts. Nothing that could fail in the wet. He held it to his ear experimentally and heard his own breathing amplified, the rustle of canvas magnified into something almost threatening. Point this toward an enemy position from higher ground, and you'd hear conversations, equipment movement, the distinctive sounds of men preparing food or digging latrines. How many have you found total? Thornley asked, setting the tube down among the papers. Maybe 20, 30, hard to say. Some old, some new. Japanese move them sometimes, change positions. Kila gestured vaguely toward the hills. They watch and they listen. Your soldiers talk too much, Captain. Make fires at wrong times. Japanese know everything you do before you do it. That confirmed what Thornley had suspected since the ambush near Eora Creek, when a reinforced platoon had walked into perfectly positioned machine gun fire, despite taking every precaution against visual observation. Someone had known they were coming, had known the exact trail they'd use and the approximate time of their approach. The casualties had been severe enough that Battalion had ordered an investigation, which meant Thornley sitting in a tent reading reports and trying to construct explanations that didn't rely on coincidence or enemy clairvoyance. He pulled out a map of the operational area and began marking the locations where Kila and the other scouts had found listening devices. Red dots accumulated along the ridge lines overlooking Australian positions, concentrated near water sources and trail junctions where men naturally gathered. Then he overlaid the patrol reports, marking in blue the times and places where units had experienced accurate enemy fire without prior visual contact. The correlation was undeniable. Japanese mortars had struck Australian positions within 30 minutes of cooking fires being lit on 17 separate occasions over the past month. Thornley checked his watch against the incident reports, looking for temporal patterns. Most of the successful mortar strikes had occurred between 0200 and 0400 hours, when Australian units typically prepared their morning rations. The Japanese clearly had observers who could see the fires, but the accuracy suggested more than visual targeting. They needed to know which fires represented significant troop concentrations and which were just scattered individuals. Sound would tell them that. The clatter of mess tins, the conversations that inevitably accompanied communal meals, the movement of multiple men in close proximity. Lieutenant Morrison entered the tent, ducking under the low canvas entrance. He'd been coordinating with the signals section, trying to determine if the Japanese had intercepted any radio communications. Quote 18, he reported, dropping a folder onto Thornley's desk. We've maintained radio silence on tactical frequencies, like ordered. If they're getting intelligence, it's not from our transmissions. Thornley showed him the map, with its overlapping patterns of red and blue marks. Morrison studied it for a long moment, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding. They're listening to us cook breakfast, he said finally, the absurdity and danger of it equally apparent in his tone. Christ, how long have they been doing this? Can't say for certain. Weeks at minimum, possibly since they established their current defensive line. Thornley lit a cigarette, the smoke rising straight up in the still air inside the tent. The question is what we do about it. We can't stop cooking entirely. Men need hot food, especially given the conditions. But we also can't keep feeding them intelligence every time someone boils water for tea. Morrison leaned over the map, tracing the ridgelines with his finger. What if we cook when they're not listening? They have to sleep sometime, rotate their observation posts, find out when they change shifts, and cook during the transition. The idea had merit, enough that Thornley immediately began considering the logistics. We'd need to know their schedule, confirm it's consistent. Then we'd have to enforce discipline across multiple units, make sure everyone adheres to specific timing windows. One section breaks the protocol and lights a fire early, we lose the advantage, and possibly the element of surprise. He tapped ash into an empty tin. But it might work. It might actually work. Keeler had been listening from the corner of the tent, his dark eyes moving between the two officers. I can watch them, he offered. Me and the other scouts. We see when they change, when new men come to listening posts. Japanese are regular, like clockwork. Always same times, same places. We can tell you when they are not paying attention. Thornley looked at the native scout, at the certainty in his expression. The Papuans had been moving through these hills for generations, knew the land and its rhythms in ways that European soldiers never would. If Keeler said the Japanese maintained a predictable schedule, that information was probably more reliable than anything signals intelligence could provide. How long to confirm their pattern? Thornley asked. 3 days, maybe 4. We watch all their posts, write down times. Then you know when to cook, when to be silent. Keela picked up the bamboo tube again, turning it in his hands. They think they are clever, listening to you, but they do not know we are listening to them. Lieutenant David Harper crouched behind a fallen log on the forward slope, field glasses pressed to his eyes, watching the Japanese observation post through a gap in the vegetation. He'd been here for 6 hours now, perfectly still except for the small movements required to track activity across the valley. His legs had gone numb an hour ago, and something that might be a leech had attached itself to his ankle, but he didn't move to check. Movement drew eyes, and the Japanese had shooters positioned specifically to watch for Australian observers doing exactly what Harper was doing now. The enemy post sat in a natural depression on the ridgeline, camouflaged well enough that Harper had needed Keela to point it out on his first observation run 3 days ago. Now he knew what to look for. The unnatural symmetry of the palm fronds, the bamboo framework visible if you caught it at the right angle, the thin trail leading up from the rear where relief personnel approached. Most importantly, he'd learned to recognize the soldiers themselves by their movements and routines. The current shift had 3 men, one with the listening equipment, one observer with binoculars, one who appeared to be recording information in a logbook. Harper checked his watch. 0742. If the pattern held, the relief would arrive in approximately 18 minutes. He documented 4 complete shift changes now, and each one followed the same schedule with mechanical precision. The Japanese relieved their listening posts every 8 hours, 0800, 1600, and midnight. The changeover took between 15 and 22 minutes, depending on how much the departing shift had to brief their replacements. During that window, there was confusion, overlapping conversations, men adjusting equipment and comparing notes, while others packed up personal items and prepared to descend the trail. At 07:58, Harper saw movement on the approach trail. Two soldiers climbing steadily, one carrying what looked like a canvas bag of rations or supplies. He made a notation in his own log, marking the exact time. Beside him, Private Jenkins whispered, "Here they come, right on schedule." Jenkins had been keeping a parallel log as verification, ensuring that Harper's observations weren't influenced by expectation or fatigue. The relief soldiers reached the observation post at 0800 exactly. Harper watched through the glasses as the handover began, the organized chaos of men trying to brief and receive information simultaneously, while also managing the basic human needs of soldiers who'd been sitting still for 8 hours. The soldier who'd been on the listening equipment stood and stretched, his movements suggesting stiffness and discomfort. The new man took his place, adjusting the bamboo tubes and putting on what appeared to be a modified headset. Meanwhile, the observer with binoculars was showing his replacement something on a hand-drawn map, both men pointing toward different sections of the Australian-held valley. The conversations were animated, voices carrying faintly across the distance, even though Harper couldn't distinguish individual words. That was the key detail Thornley had wanted confirmed. During shift change, the Japanese talked. They forgot about noise discipline while they transferred knowledge from one team to the next, discussed what they'd heard or seen, complained about conditions or lack of sleep. For those precious minutes, they weren't listening to the Australians because they were too busy listening to each other. Harper timed the entire exchange. 18 minutes from the arrival of the relief soldiers to the departure of the original shift down the trail. 18 minutes when the listening post was focused inward rather than outward. When intelligence gathering stopped and administrative routine took over. He recorded the time in his log with a sense of satisfaction. 4 consecutive observations, 4 identical patterns. This wasn't random variation or coincidence. This was Japanese military procedure, reliable and predictable. But as Harper prepared to withdraw from his observation position, something changed. A third soldier appeared on the trail, moving faster than the others had, his posture suggesting urgency. He carried papers in his hand and went directly to the soldier who appeared to be in charge of the post. A brief conversation followed, heads bent together over the documents. Then the soldier in charge turned and looked directly down into the valley where the Australian positions lay hidden in the jungle, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Harper's stomach tighten with unease. The new soldier, the one who'd arrived with papers, remained at the post, even after the relieved shift departed. He set up what looked like additional listening equipment, a second set of bamboo tubes positioned at a different angle from the first. Then he produced a notebook and began writing, occasionally pausing to consult a pocket watch before making additional entries. Harper watched this new development with growing concern. Was this a normal upgrade to their surveillance capability, or had someone on the Japanese side noticed something unusual about Australian activity patterns? Jenkins nudged Harper's arm and pointed to another ridgeline, roughly 400 meters to the north. Harper shifted his field glasses and felt his chest constrict. Another Japanese observation post was being reinforced, this one receiving what looked like a full replacement team plus additional personnel. They were setting up more equipment, expanding their listening array, acting like men who'd received orders to increase surveillance coverage. Either this was routine enhancement of their intelligence network, or someone had filed a report that suggested the Australians were changing their behavior in ways that required closer monitoring. Harper thought about Corporal Yamada's observation logs, about the questions that a careful analyst might ask when cooking fires suddenly appeared at different times than expected. He thought about intelligence officers on both sides playing the same game, trying to predict enemy actions based on pattern analysis and behavioral changes. If the Japanese had noticed the shift in Australian cooking schedules during their observation windows, they might be trying to determine whether it was random variation or deliberate operational security. And if they suspected it was deliberate, they'd want to know what the Australians had figured out and how to counter it. The protocol that Thornley was developing, cooking only during Japanese shift changes, relied on the enemy maintaining their current schedule and procedures. But what if they changed those procedures in response to Australian behavioral changes? What if this turned into an escalating cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation, each side trying to stay one step ahead of the other's intelligence gathering? Harper made careful notes about the additional personnel and equipment, knowing Thornley would want every detail. Then he began his careful withdrawal, moving inches at a time through the undergrowth, aware that the expanded Japanese observation network made his own position exponentially more dangerous than it had been that morning. The orders came down through company commanders in hushed conversations behind supply tents and in dugouts that served as temporary headquarters. Nothing written, nothing that could be captured and analyzed if a patrol got overrun or a position had to be abandoned in a hurry. Sergeant Morrow received his instructions from Captain Henshaw, who'd received them from Major Collins, who'd gotten them directly from Thornley's tent, along with a map showing Japanese listening post locations and a timetable that had to be memorized rather than copied. Cook fires permitted only during 3 specific windows each day: 0400 to 0420, 1155 to 1215, and 1550 to 1610. Outside those windows, every man would eat cold rations, regardless of hunger, exhaustion, or the miserable, grinding monotony of tinned meat that tasted like salted cardboard. Morrow gathered his section after dark, when the jungle sounds provided natural cover for voices kept low enough that they wouldn't carry beyond the immediate perimeter. He explained the new protocol without explaining the reasoning behind it, because most of the men didn't need to know about Japanese listening posts to follow orders. What they needed to know was that lighting fires at unauthorized times would get people killed, possibly them, possibly their mates in adjacent positions. Walsh started to ask why, then caught Davies's warning glance and shut his mouth before the question fully formed. Quote 33. Corporal Henderson said, but quietly, almost conversationally. Quote 34. Henderson had been a school teacher in Melbourne before the war, the kind of man who questioned procedures on principle and wanted logical explanations for arbitrary-seeming rules. Morrow looked at him with the flat expression that preceded either violence or patience, and in this case, chose patience. Quote 35. The section absorbed this information in silence. Some of the men, the ones who'd been in theater long enough to develop instincts about which orders mattered and which were just command staff justifying their existence, accepted it immediately. Others, the replacements who still thought war operated according to some rational system of cause and effect, struggled visibly with the arbitrariness. But they'd all seen what happened to men who ignored protocols they didn't understand, had attended burial services for soldiers who thought they knew better than the people trying to keep them breathing. At the battalion aid station, Dr. Graham Fraser heard about the new protocol from a wounded corporal who'd been evacuated from the forward positions. The man had taken shrapnel from a mortar round that hit his section's position at 0230, right when they'd been preparing their morning tea in violation of orders they hadn't yet received. 3 men dead, 5 wounded, all because someone lit a fire at the wrong time and the Japanese bracketed the position with frightening accuracy. The corporal kept repeating that they'd done the same thing for weeks without incident, that there was no way the enemy could have known they were there in the dark. Fraser cleaned the wounds and administered morphine while listening to the confused anger in the man's voice, the desperate need to understand why following routine had suddenly become fatal. Fraser had been a surgeon in Sydney before enlisting, had worked in hospitals where procedures existed for good reasons, even when those reasons weren't immediately apparent to patients or junior staff. He understood systems, understood that sometimes you followed protocols because people smarter or better informed than you had determined those protocols saved lives. But he also understood human nature, understood that soldiers would only follow arbitrary-seeming rules if they believed those rules had purpose beyond arbitrary command authority. He found Thornley 2 hours later, after finishing with the wounded and writing letters to families explaining injuries in terms that wouldn't trigger censorship while still conveying the seriousness of the situations. Thornley was in his tent, studying maps and drinking tea that had gone cold an hour earlier. Fraser didn't ask permission to enter, just ducked under the canvas and sat down on an ammunition crate without invitation. Quote 36. Fraser said without preamble. Quote 37. Thornley set down his teacup and rubbed his eyes. Quote 38. Quote 39. Fraser countered. Quote 40. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Quote 41. Thornley considered this, turning the cold teacup in his hands. The doctor had a point. Blind obedience worked for simple commands in immediate situations, but complex protocols that required sustained discipline across multiple units needed something more. Soldiers needed to believe they were part of a larger system, that their individual discomfort served a collective purpose. The problem was calibrating how much information to provide without compromising the operational security that made the protocol effective in the first place. Quote 42, Thornley said finally. Quote 43. Fraser nodded, satisfied with the compromise. He stood to leave, then paused at the tent entrance. Thornley had been asking himself the same question since receiving Harper's latest report about increased Japanese observation activity. Then we adapt, he said, though the answer felt inadequate even as he spoke it. We watch them, they watch us, and we both try to stay ahead of what the other side is learning. It's intelligence work. There are no permanent advantages, only temporary ones that last until someone figures out what you're doing and develops a counter. The doctor left without responding, but his expression suggested he understood the implications. This wasn't a solution. It was a temporary exploitation of enemy procedure, effective only until the Japanese noticed their vulnerability and closed it. The question wasn't whether the protocol would eventually fail, but whether it would last long enough to matter. Lieutenant Marcus Webb led his reconnaissance section through the pre-dawn darkness with the deliberate caution of a man who'd learned that haste in the jungle meant casualties. They'd been moving for 3 hours, skirting known Japanese positions and mapping new defensive works that intelligence needed documented before the next Australian push. The mission required another 4 hours of observation before they could withdraw, which meant they'd miss the morning cooking window entirely. Webb had made sure every man carried extra cold rations, had briefed them twice on the importance of maintaining the protocol even when it seemed unnecessarily rigid. Some had grumbled, but they'd loaded their packs with additional tins and accepted the inconvenience. At 0200 hours, Webb called a halt in a defensive position that offered good sight lines and covered approaches. The men settled into a loose perimeter, weapons oriented outward, no talking above a whisper. Private Thompson pulled out a tin of bully beef and worked it open with his bayonet, the metal on metal scraping loud in the relative quiet. Webb checked his watch. 2 hours until the cooking window. 2 hours of cold food and colder comfort, while they waited for the Japanese shift change that would give them permission to be human for 15 minutes. But Thompson's hands were shaking as he tried to open the tin, the tremors visible even in the darkness. Webb had noticed it earlier during the march, the private stumbling over roots that should have been visible, his movements lacking the usual coordination. Now, watching the man struggle with a simple task, Webb moved closer and put a hand on Thompson's shoulder. The private was burning up, fever radiating through his sodden uniform. "How long?" Webb asked quietly. "Since yesterday afternoon, sir. Thought it would pass." Thompson's voice carried the thickness of illness, the strain of a man trying to function while his body fought something that wouldn't be reasoned with. Malaria, dengue, or one of a dozen other tropical fevers that reduced strong men to shivering wrecks. The fact that Thompson had made it through 3 hours of night patrol without collapsing was testament to stubbornness more than health. Webb faced an immediate problem. Thompson needed hot fluids, needed warmth, needed to be evacuated to the aid station. But lighting a fire now, outside the authorized window, would broadcast their position to any Japanese listening posts in range. Webb had attended the briefing, understood the protocol's purpose, knew that breaking it risked not just his section, but other Australian units whose positions might be compromised if the enemy triangulated multiple fire sources and deduced patrol patterns. Corporal Stevens crawled over, took one look at Thompson, and understood the situation without explanation. Quote 49. It was the correct tactical decision, the one that followed protocol and preserved operational security. It was also the decision that might kill Thompson if the fever spiked during the 4-hour journey back through terrain they'd need to navigate in darkness while carrying or supporting a sick man. Webb looked at his watch again, 0212. The next authorized cooking window was at 0400, less than 2 hours away. If Thompson could hold on that long, they could heat water for tea, get fluids into him, stabilize him enough for evacuation. But 2 hours was a long time for a man burning with fever, and Webb had seen strong soldiers deteriorate rapidly once tropical illness took hold. The choice was simple and terrible. Follow the protocol and risk Thompson's life, or break the protocol and risk everyone's position. "Give him your blanket," Webb told Stevens. "Wrap him up, keep him warm as you can. We wait for the window." He made the decision without hesitation, but that didn't make it easier. Command meant choosing between bad options and living with the consequences. Meant trusting that the intelligence officers who'd created the protocol had good reasons for its strictness. Thompson would have to endure. They all would. At 0345, Thompson's condition had worsened. The fever had spiked high enough that the man was barely coherent, mumbling about his mother and a cricket match he'd played as a boy in Brisbane. Stevens kept him wrapped in both available blankets while the rest of the section maintained their watch, hyper-aware now of every sound in the darkness. Webb had already made the decision to abort the mission after the cooking window, to get Thompson evacuated, even if it meant incomplete intelligence. Some things mattered more than maps and defensive positions. 0400 arrived with agonizing slowness. Webb gave the order, and 3 men immediately began preparing a small fire, using dry wood they'd collected and positioned during the wait. The flames caught quickly, controlled and minimal, but providing blessed heat. Stevens heated water in Thompson's mess tin, while another private prepared tea with enough sugar to provide fast energy. They got fluids into Thompson, hot tea that he drank in shaking gulps, his body responding to the warmth even as his mind wandered through fever dreams. The fire burned for exactly 12 minutes before Webb ordered it extinguished. They'd used less than half their authorized window, but Thompson had gotten warm fluids and the color had returned to his face, the shaking reduced from violent tremors to manageable shivers. Stevens organized the evacuation detail, while Webb repositioned the remaining men to continue observation duties. The mission would proceed, just with reduced personnel. Thompson would live, assuming the fever broke and no complications developed during the journey back. As the evacuation team disappeared into the jungle, supporting Thompson between them, Webb reflected on the calculus of the protocol. It had forced him to make Thompson suffer for nearly 2 hours, when immediate heat might have stabilized him faster. But it had also ensured that when they did light the fire, it occurred during a window when Japanese observation was theoretically compromised. Whether that theoretical advantage was worth Thompson's suffering, Webb couldn't say. He only knew that war forced impossible choices, and the protocol was simply one more framework for making those choices, according to principles that extended beyond individual situations. At 0420, exactly as the authorized window closed, Webb heard the distinctive crump of mortar rounds impacting somewhere to the south, perhaps 2 kilometers distant. The explosions came in a cluster, 6 or 7 rounds in rapid succession, the pattern suggesting a pre-registered target rather than ranging shots. Someone had lit a fire outside the protocol window, or lit it in the wrong location, or simply had terrible luck. Webb would never know which. He only knew that the protocol existed for reasons written in blood and validated by the sound of those distant explosions. Proof that the Japanese were indeed listening and targeting based on what they heard. Private Davies, who'd been on watch during the mortar attack, turned to Webb with an expression that mixed vindication and horror. "The protocol works, sir," he said quietly. "God help us, but it works." Webb didn't respond, just checked his watch and made a notation in his log. The mission continued. Thompson was evacuated. The fire had burned during the authorized window. Everything had proceeded according to protocol, which meant everything was simultaneously correct and unsatisfying, a victory that felt like compromise. Corporal Takeshi Yamada's suspicions had calcified into certainty over the past week, hardening from vague unease into documented pattern that he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The Australian cooking fires now appeared exclusively during 3 narrow windows each day. timed with precision that suggested coordination rather than individual hunger. More troubling, these windows coincided almost exactly with the shift changes at his own listening post, and the others scattered across the ridgeline. He'd mapped it carefully in his log, cross-referencing the times of Australian fire activity against the duty roster that governed Japanese observation schedules. The correlation was undeniable and deeply unsettling. He'd submitted his first report to Lieutenant Sakamoto 4 days ago, a detailed analysis showing the temporal patterns and suggesting that the Australians had somehow identified Japanese surveillance procedures. Sakamoto had read it, grunted non-committally, and filed it with other intelligence summaries that accumulated in canvas bags, waiting for transport to division headquarters. Whether anyone with authority to act on the information had actually read Yamada's report remained unclear. The Japanese command structure moved information upward with glacial slowness, each level adding its own assessment and delay before passing documents to the next echelon. Yesterday, Yamada had submitted a second report, this one more urgent in tone. He documented 17 separate instances of Australian fires appearing during shift changes, noted the complete absence of fire activity during periods of active Japanese observation, and calculated the statistical improbability of this pattern occurring by chance. The mathematics was straightforward enough that even officers without specialized training could understand the implications. Either the Australians had developed telepathic abilities to predict Japanese schedules, or they'd identified the listening posts and were exploiting the surveillance gaps created during personnel transitions. Sergeant Hayashi read this second report with the careful attention he gave to anything that might affect their survival. Quote 54, he said, not quite a question. Quote 55. Quote 56. Yamada kept his voice neutral, presenting analysis rather than alarm, but the implications carried their own weight. Hayashi stared out at the Australian-held valley, his expression unreadable in the morning light filtering through the camouflage netting. Quote 57. He turned back to Yamada. Quote 58. But before Yamada could begin drafting the new report, the situation evolved in ways that made documentation seem suddenly inadequate. At 11:57, 3 minutes before the midday cooking window that Yamada had identified as one of the Australian patterns, Lieutenant Sakamoto appeared at the listening post with 2 privates carrying additional equipment. He dismissed the current observation team and had the new equipment installed with efficiency that suggested pre-planning rather than improvised response. Quote 59, Sakamoto announced without preamble. Quote 60. He looked directly at Yamada. Quote 61. Yamada felt simultaneous relief and apprehension. Relief that his analysis had been taken seriously, that the command structure had responded appropriately to the intelligence. Apprehension because the Japanese response would inevitably trigger an Australian counter-response, an escalating cycle of adaptation that neither side could sustain indefinitely. War was supposed to be about decisive action, clear victories and defeats. Instead, it had become this grinding chess match of incremental advantages and marginal adjustments. At precisely noon, the expanded observation team was in place and actively monitoring the Australian sector. Yamada watched through binoculars as cooking fires appeared across the valley, right on schedule. The Australians apparently unaware that Japanese surveillance procedures had changed. The listening equipment picked up the sounds of men preparing food, the clatter of mess tins, and the low murmur of conversation. Sakamoto made notations on his map, marking the fire locations with the satisfaction of a man confirming his tactical assumptions. But Yamada noticed something that troubled him. The fires were too obvious, too concentrated in specific locations that would be easy to target. The Australians had maintained strict dispersal during previous weeks, spreading their cooking activities across wide areas to minimise the effectiveness of artillery targeting. Now they were clustering fires in ways that seemed almost designed to invite Japanese response. Either they'd become careless, or this was something else, some new variation in the pattern that Yamada couldn't yet decode. _quote_62_1 of the junior observers asked Sakamoto, eager to exploit the intelligence. Quote 63. Sakamoto considered this, studying the map and the fire locations. For a moment, Yamada thought he would give the order, would authorize the barrage that would kill or wound dozens of Australian soldiers and validate the entire surveillance operation. Instead, the lieutenant shook his head slowly. Quote 64. The caution surprised Yamada, coming from an officer who'd never hesitated to authorize mortar strikes in the past. But it also suggested that Sakamoto understood they were engaged in something more complex than simple tactical advantage. Both sides were learning, adapting, trying to predict and counter the other's moves in a game where the rules kept changing and the stakes were measured in lives rather than points. The fires burned for their allotted 15 minutes, then were systematically extinguished across the Australian sector. The coordinated timing was impossible to miss. Someone was enforcing strict discipline, ensuring that every unit adhered to the protocol, regardless of individual circumstances. Yamada made detailed notes about the behavior, documenting the start and end times, the locations, the sounds picked up by the listening equipment. This information would go into another report, another piece of analysis that would move slowly upward through the command structure, while both sides continued their careful dance of observation and counter-observation. What bothered Yamada most was the realization that this pattern could continue indefinitely, each side making marginal adjustments to counter the other's advantages, neither able to achieve decisive superiority. The Australians would eventually notice that fires lit during shift changes were now being observed and targeted. They'd adapt their procedures again, find new timing windows or new methods to disguise their activities. The Japanese would respond with further enhancements to their surveillance network. Round and round, intelligence and counterintelligence, while the actual war, the fighting and dying that was supposed to resolve something, remained locked in stalemate among these miserable hills. The monsoon arrived with the inevitability of all seasonal transformations in New Guinea, turning the jungle into a vertical ocean where rain fell with such force that conversation became impossible and visibility shrank to arm's length. Sergeant Morrow had known it was coming. The Papuan guides had warned him 3 days earlier, reading signs in cloud formations and bird behavior that meant nothing to European soldiers. Now the rain hammered down with tropical intensity, transforming every depression into a stream and every stream into a torrent that could sweep away unwary men. The rain created immediate problems for the cooking protocol. Wet wood wouldn't light, or if it did, produced smoke that hung low in the saturated air instead of dispersing, creating visible markers that negated any advantage gained from timing. Morrow's section huddled in their improvised shelters during the 0400 cooking window, trying desperately to start fires with kindling they'd kept wrapped in ground sheets and canvas. Davies managed to coax flames from wood shavings and a precious handful of dry tinder he'd hoarded, but the fire sputtered and threatened to die every time raindrops found their way through the overhead cover. Walsh crouched beside the struggling fire, trying to boil water in his mess tin while protecting the flames with his body. The tin filled with rainwater faster than the fire could heat it, creating a lukewarm mixture that defeated the entire purpose of hot rations. "This is useless," he muttered, loud enough for Morrow to hear. "We're going to freeze to death trying to follow a protocol that doesn't work in the bloody rain." Morrow didn't disagree with the assessment, but disagreement wasn't the point. The protocol existed, the orders were clear, and adaptation was the responsibility of the men implementing the orders, rather than an excuse to abandon them. "Preposition your dry wood," he told the section, raising his voice to be heard over the drumming rain. "Keep it covered between cooking windows. Share fires between positions so we're not trying to start a dozen separate blazes. Use whatever burns, tree resin, rubber if you've got it, anything that'll catch and hold heat long enough to boil water." The men adapted because that's what soldiers did when circumstances changed and orders remained constant. They collected dry wood during the brief periods between rain squalls, storing it in ammunition crates and wrapped bundles that stayed relatively moisture-free. They identified tree species that burned even when wet, learned which resins would ignite with minimal coaxing, discovered that positioning fires under dense canopy provided just enough shelter to keep flames alive during all but the heaviest downpours. The learning process involved failure. fires that died despite careful preparation, cooking windows wasted on unsuccessful attempts to generate heat. But gradually, the section developed techniques that worked within the constraints imposed by weather and protocol alike. But the rain affected Japanese surveillance capabilities too, creating a variable that neither intelligence officers nor frontline soldiers had fully anticipated. Sound traveled differently in saturated air, muffled by the constant percussion of raindrops hitting vegetation. The bamboo listening tubes filled with water, degrading their effectiveness. Japanese observers found that their field glasses were useless in the heavy rain, that their carefully mapped approach routes had become impassable streams, that maintaining watch schedules required rotating personnel more frequently to prevent hypothermia and exhaustion. Lieutenant Harper, still conducting his observation missions despite conditions that made visibility nearly impossible, noticed the changes in Japanese procedure during his 5th day of monsoon watching. The listening posts were being manned by smaller crews, sometimes just one soldier instead of the usual 3. Shift changes became irregular, delayed by the difficulty of moving along trails that had transformed into cascading watercourses. On 2 occasions, Harper observed Japanese positions being temporarily abandoned entirely when flash flooding threatened the ridgeline installations. He documented these changes in reports that reached Thornley's tent in soggy bundles, the paper threatening to disintegrate from moisture exposure despite protective wrapping. Thornley read them with growing concern that had nothing to do with rain damage, and everything to do with tactical implications. If Japanese surveillance was degraded during the monsoon, that created opportunities for Australian operations that wouldn't exist during dry weather. But it also meant the cooking protocol might become unnecessary or even counterproductive if the enemy couldn't effectively monitor Australian positions, regardless of timing. The question was whether to maintain the protocol during the monsoon or temporarily suspend it until weather conditions improved and Japanese surveillance capabilities returned to normal effectiveness. Thornley convened a meeting with his company commanders in a tent where rain hammered the canvas so loudly that men had to lean close to hear each other speak. The discussion quickly revealed divergent opinions based on different interpretations of limited intelligence. Captain Henshaw argued for maintaining the protocol regardless of weather. The moment we suspend it, we lose the discipline we've built up. Men will start cooking whenever they want, and when the monsoon ends, we'll have to retrain everyone on proper procedure. Better to keep the protocol active, even if it's currently unnecessary. His logic emphasized consistency and unit cohesion over tactical flexibility. Major Collins disagreed, pointing out that the protocol imposed real costs in terms of soldier comfort and morale. We're forcing men to eat cold rations in freezing rain because of Japanese surveillance that might not even be operational right now. That's poor leadership if we're applying rules mechanically without considering whether they still serve their original purpose. He advocated for suspending the protocol during heavy monsoon periods, resuming it when weather cleared and Japanese observation capabilities returned to normal. Thornley listened to both arguments while studying Harper's latest reports, trying to extract certainty from incomplete information. The truth was that nobody knew exactly how degraded Japanese surveillance had become. Harper could observe their listening posts, but he couldn't assess the effectiveness of their equipment or determine whether they'd developed alternative monitoring methods that worked in wet conditions. Suspending the protocol based on assumptions about enemy capability was gambling with intelligence that had been gathered at considerable risk and effort. Quote 71, Thornley decided, his voice cutting through the competing arguments. Quote 72, he paused, letting the decision settle. Quote 73, the commanders accepted the decision with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but acceptance was sufficient. Orders filtered down through the chain of command, reaching sections and platoons as practical guidance about maintaining fire discipline, even when weather made cooking difficult. The protocol continued, adapted but intact, a framework that persisted through environmental changes because the underlying intelligence concerns remained valid regardless of rain. But that night, as Thornley sat in his tent listening to the monsoon rage outside, he wondered how long the protocol could survive the accumulated weight of adaptation and modification. Every change to accommodate new circumstances added complexity, created room for misunderstanding and inconsistent implementation. At some point, the protocol would become so layered with exceptions and special cases that it would cease to function as a coherent system and devolve into confusion. The question wasn't whether that collapse would occur, but whether it would happen before or after the tactical situation changed enough to make the entire framework obsolete. Private Robert Sullivan arrived at the forward positions on a supply run, one of the fresh replacements who'd completed training in Australia and been shipped north with minimal preparation for what awaited them in the New Guinea highlands. He'd heard stories about the fighting, about the mud and disease, and Japanese soldiers who appeared from nowhere to attack positions that seemed secure. What he hadn't heard about was the cooking protocol, because nobody had bothered to brief replacement personnel on operational procedures that weren't written in any manual or training document. Sullivan's first night with the section passed without incident. He ate cold rations like everyone else, assumed that was standard procedure in forward positions, and kept his questions to himself because replacements who talked too much earned reputations as liabilities. But on the second night, exhausted from a day of digging drainage ditches and hauling supplies through knee-deep mud, Sullivan made a decision that seemed entirely reasonable given his incomplete understanding of the tactical situation. At 2300 hours, with the temperature dropping and his uniform soaked through from earlier rain, Sullivan gathered dry wood from the supply Davies had been hoarding and built a small fire to warm himself. He didn't announce his intention or ask permission because warming yourself when cold seemed like basic self-care rather than a decision requiring command approval. The fire caught quickly. Sullivan had been a Boy Scout before the war and knew how to build efficient blazes, and within minutes he had flames producing blessed heat that drove back the clammy chill of the tropical night. Davy saw the fire and moved toward Sullivan's position with frightening speed. His face twisted in an expression that combined rage and terror. He kicked the burning wood apart, scattering flames and embers across the wet ground, then stomped on each piece until nothing remained but smoking char. Quote, 74. Davies hissed, grabbing Sullivan by his webbing and pulling him close. Quote, 75. Sullivan stammered confusion, unable to understand why building a fire warranted such violent response. Around them, other members of the section were scrambling into defensive positions, weapons oriented outward, everyone suddenly alert in ways that suggested imminent threat rather than simple discipline violation. Sergeant Morrow appeared from the darkness, his presence somehow more frightening than Davies's anger, because it carried the weight of authority and consequence. "Who authorized that fire?" Morrow asked, his voice perfectly calm, in a way that suggested fury held under rigid control. "Nobody, Sergeant. I was cold. I just thought—" Sullivan stopped, realizing that explanation was insufficient and possibly damning. "I didn't know. Nobody told me about fire restrictions." Morrow stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Davies. "Get him behind cover. Everyone stays alert for the next 30 minutes. If we're lucky, the Japs weren't paying attention, or they'll think it was just signal communication." He looked back at Sullivan with an expression that mixed disgust and resignation. "You light another fire outside authorized windows, I'll shoot you myself. Understand?" Sullivan understood that he'd made a terrible mistake, though he still didn't fully comprehend what that mistake was or why it mattered. He crouched behind a fallen log with his rifle, watching the darkness and waiting for consequences that might or might not arrive. The section maintained defensive positions for 40 minutes, everyone hyper-alert, until Morrow finally gave the stand-down order and men gradually relaxed from combat readiness to normal vigilance. The mortar rounds arrived at 23:42, 11 minutes after the stand-down. 6 shells in rapid succession, bracketing the section's position with accuracy that suggested pre-registered coordinates rather than hasty targeting. The first round hit 30 meters to Sullivan's left, throwing mud and shrapnel in a fountain of destruction that shredded vegetation and sent men diving for whatever cover they could find. The subsequent rounds walked across the position in a pattern designed to catch soldiers attempting to escape the impact zone. Sullivan pressed himself into the mud as explosions marched past his position, the overpressure feeling like repeated punches to his chest and head. Something hot sliced through the air above him, shrapnel or debris, he couldn't tell which, and he heard screaming from somewhere nearby, voices calling for medics in tones that suggested serious wounds rather than minor injuries. The barrage lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though time dilated under fire in ways that made accurate assessment impossible. When silence returned, broken only by ringing ears and scattered moans, Sullivan lifted his head to survey the damage. 2 men were down, possibly 3. Davies was applying field dressings to someone Sullivan couldn't identify in the darkness. Morrow was on the radio calling for artillery support and medical evacuation, his voice steady despite the chaos. The section's position had been compromised, their location known to Japanese forward observers who'd obviously been listening when Sullivan lit his unauthorized fire. Davies came for Sullivan once the wounded had been stabilized and evacuation procedures initiated. He didn't speak, just grabbed the replacement by his collar and dragged him to where Sergeant Morrow stood, studying the impact pattern of the mortar rounds. Quote 81, Davies said, releasing Sullivan with a shove. Quote 82. Morrow lit a cigarette, the brief flare of his lighter illuminating a face that looked decades older than it had that morning. Quote 83, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Quote 84. Sullivan felt bile rising in his throat, understanding finally crashing down with weight that threatened to buckle his knees. His decision to build a fire, made from ignorance and discomfort, had directly caused the mortar attack that wounded his section mates. Men were hurt, possibly dying, because he didn't know about a protocol that nobody had bothered to explain to replacement personnel arriving from training units that operated in different tactical environments. I didn't know, Sullivan repeated, the words inadequate, but all he had available. Nobody told me. I just got here. You didn't ask, Morrow interrupted. You didn't observe what everyone else was doing. You made assumptions based on your own comfort instead of watching and learning how veterans survived in this environment. He took a long drag on his cigarette. 3 men are wounded because of that. You'll carry that. Maybe it'll make you more careful. Maybe it'll get you killed because you're too afraid to make any decisions at all. Either way, you'll remember tonight for the rest of your life, however long that turns out to be. The wounded were evacuated 40 minutes later, carried on stretchers through trails that had become treacherous mudslides. Sullivan helped with the evacuation, bearing the weight of men who'd been injured because of his mistake, listening to their labored breathing and occasional moans of pain. One of them, a corporal named Henderson, who Sullivan barely knew, looked at him as they loaded him onto the stretcher. Henderson didn't speak, didn't accuse, just stared with eyes that held neither forgiveness nor condemnation. Only recognition that this was war, and mistakes had consequences measured in blood. The section relocated after the evacuation, abandoning their compromised position for a new location 200 meters west. They moved in complete silence, every man hyper-aware that Japanese observers might be tracking their displacement, that follow-up artillery could arrive at any moment. Sullivan carried his share of equipment and maintained tactical spacing, but he felt separate from the unit now, marked by failure in ways that would take time and competence to overcome, if they could be overcome at all. When they established the new position and Morrow authorized rest for half the section, Davies sat beside Sullivan in the darkness. Quote, 90, he said quietly. Quote, 91. The Japanese withdrawal from the Kokoda sector came 3 weeks after the monsoon ended, not as dramatic retreat, but as methodical repositioning to more defensible terrain further north. Australian patrols advancing into abandoned positions found the infrastructure of enemy occupation, dugouts carefully constructed and then deliberately collapsed, supply caches emptied or destroyed, and the listening posts that had governed so much tactical behavior over the preceding months. Lieutenant Harper led the patrol that discovered the main observation post, the one Corporal Yamada had operated from during those critical weeks when the cooking protocol was first being developed and tested. The position was more elaborate than Harper had imagined during his distant observations. A network of interconnected shelters with excellent overhead cover, multiple listening stations oriented toward different sectors of the Australian defensive line, and a communications setup that suggested regular reporting to higher command, rather than isolated tactical intelligence gathering. The bamboo listening tubes were still in place, though several had been damaged during the withdrawal. Harper examined them with the careful attention of a man who'd spent weeks trying to understand their capabilities from incomplete evidence. They were simpler than expected, but no less effective for their simplicity. Acoustic amplifiers that required no power source or complex maintenance, just positioning and patient operators willing to spend hours listening to enemy activities. He carried one back to battalion headquarters as a souvenir and proof of concept, tangible evidence that the protocol had been based on real enemy capability rather than theoretical threat. More valuable than the equipment were the documents left behind in the observation post, papers that Japanese soldiers had apparently tried to burn, but had only partially destroyed before abandoning the position. Among the charred fragments, Australian intelligence officers found portions of Yamada's observation logs, meticulously detailed records of Australian fire activity, notations about timing patterns, and analysis suggesting that the enemy had recognised Australian adaptation to Japanese surveillance procedures. The reports documented the entire cycle of intelligence and counterintelligence, each side learning and responding to the other's actions in an escalating game that neither could definitively win. Captain Thornley studied these recovered documents in his tent, comparing Yamada's observations against his own intelligence summaries and the timeline of protocol development. The correlation was both satisfying and unsettling. Satisfying because it confirmed that the protocol had been necessary and effective, unsettling because it revealed how close the Japanese had come to completely neutralizing Australian counter-surveillance measures. If the monsoon hadn't degraded Japanese observation capabilities at a critical moment, if command had responded more quickly to Yamada's reports, if any of a dozen variables had aligned differently, the cooking protocol might have failed, and Australian casualties would have been significantly higher. But there was no way to quantify lives saved by a protocol that prevented attacks rather than winning battles. The protocol existed in the negative space of war, in the artillery barrages that never occurred because targets were never identified, in the ambushes that failed because patrol movements went undetected during critical surveillance gaps. Thornley could document its existence and implementation, could show that Australian units had maintained discipline despite hardship and confusion, but he couldn't prove that discipline had mattered in ways that altered outcomes rather than simply postponing inevitable losses. Sergeant Morrow kept a fragment of the Japanese observation log that mentioned his section's position, a single line in careful characters that none of his men could read, but that intelligence had translated as __92_. The notation was dated 2 days before Sullivan's unauthorized fire and the subsequent mortar attack, proof that Japanese observers had been tracking the section's activities with precision that made Morrow's enforcement of the protocol seem less like arbitrary discipline and more like the difference between survival and casualty statistics. Sullivan saw the notation during a section briefing, where Morrow explained what intelligence had learned from the captured documents. The replacement, who'd cost 3 men their blood and 1 his leg, understood then that the protocol hadn't been created to make soldiers miserable, but to exploit a specific vulnerability in enemy intelligence procedures. The knowledge didn't erase his guilt about the unauthorized fire, but it contextualized that guilt within a larger system where individual mistakes contributed to patterns that affected outcomes beyond immediate circumstances. The protocol itself was never formalized in written orders or tactical manuals. It existed as oral tradition passed from veterans to replacements, as whispered briefings that emphasized timing without explaining underlying intelligence sources, as a framework that persisted because men who understood it survived to train those who didn't. When the fighting moved to different terrain against different enemies using different surveillance methods, the specific timing windows became irrelevant, but the principle remained, that enemy intelligence gathering had patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited through disciplined behavior and careful observation. Years later, during post-war interviews and historical documentation efforts, soldiers who'd served in the Kokoda Campaign would mention the cooking restrictions in passing, usually as examples of the arbitrary hardships that characterized jungle warfare. Few understood the full context of why those restrictions existed, or how they'd been developed through the intersection of native scout observations, signals intelligence, and methodical enemy analysis. The protocol remained classified long after its tactical relevance had expired, buried in intelligence archives that documented the unglamorous work of pattern recognition and procedural exploitation that constituted most of what determined whether men lived or died in environments where visibility measured in meters and every sound carried potential consequence. The bamboo listening tubes ended up in museums and private collections, artifacts of improvised technology that spoke to the resourcefulness of soldiers working with limited equipment in hostile environments. But the real story wasn't in the technology. It was in the patient corporal who noticed patterns and the intelligence officer who believed those patterns mattered, in the protocols developed to exploit enemy procedures and the discipline required to maintain those protocols under conditions that made compliance feel arbitrary and cruel, in the uncomfortable truth that modern warfare was as much about listening and timing as about courage and firepower. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. Your engagement helps more historical narratives reach audiences interested in the unglamorous details that determine survival in forgotten theaters of war.